What if everything you thought you knew about Meghan Markle's silence was a lie? That's the question the palace is grappling with right now. It's not an accusation whispered behind closed doors, or a story passed along through rumor-laden corridors. It's evidence, actual traceable evidence. Encrypted messages, carefully sent and carefully hidden, linking Meghan directly to the narrative of a book that shocked the monarchy, Finding Freedom. And the discovery didn't come from the media, didn't come from investigative journalists, and certainly didn't come from Meghan herself. It came from her brother-in-law, Prince William, who stumbled upon something no one was meant to see, something that could unravel the carefully curated image she has maintained for years. But before we continue, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It began with a quiet scan of internal communications, a routine check of emails flagged for potential breaches. Routine, except nothing in the palace is ever routine when it concerns public perception and the fragile balance of secrecy that surrounds the royal family. William, meticulous, cautious, ever aware of the optics, noticed anomalies. Strings of encrypted correspondence between Meghan and a figure few outside the inner circles recognized at first. A ghostwriter, one of the contributors to the very book that had seemed to expose truths about Harry and Meghan's life abroad. At first glance, they appeared innocuous. But the pattern, the timing, the content, carefully examined, told a different story. Imagine the realization hitting like a cold gust through an open window. The public narrative, Meghan's repeated denials, the carefully worded statements, the media-friendly interviews, all contradicted what these emails suggested. The emails weren't just casual notes, they were precise, detailed, strategic. They contained accounts of private conversations, personal opinions, and intimate moments that had, until now, only existed within the walls of family homes or private engagements. And all of it was being shared with an author whose work would later be presented as a neutral, insider account. At this moment, the stakes could not have been higher. The monarchy operates on centuries of tradition, protocol, and above all, discretion. To have one member secretly feeding personal information while publicly denying any involvement is not just a breach of trust. It's a seismic disruption. And the question lingers for everyone watching, everyone reading. Why? Why would Meghan risk such exposure? Was it ambition? Was it control over her narrative? Or was it something deeper, something no one outside the palace has yet glimpsed? The public has long been fascinated by Meghan Markle. The media portrays her as both a modern icon and a polarizing figure. Admirers hail her independence, her intelligence, her commitment to causes, while detractors accuse her of manipulation, secrecy, and ego-driven decisions. Yet even the most loyal supporters could not have anticipated what these encrypted emails revealed. Because what William discovered did more than suggest she was communicating. It proved she was orchestrating, deliberately feeding the narrative that would later define her in Harry's story. And it wasn't sloppy or accidental. The emails were encrypted, intentionally hidden, carefully timed. Each message carried fragments of information that, when assembled, formed a mosaic of personal disclosure. Some were innocuous, commentary about public events, descriptions of royal tours, but others were far more revealing. Names, dates, private conversations, intimate details of interactions that had been considered confidential. There was a meticulous attention to how these tidbits would be used, how they would be interpreted by a ghostwriter, and ultimately by the public. From the perspective of the palace, this was more than a breach of protocol. It was a betrayal. Protocol is not a set of arbitrary rules. It is a system designed to protect not just the family, but the institution itself. To feed private information to an author while publicly denying involvement is a calculated act that destabilizes trust at every level. And yet, from Meghan's perspective, perhaps this was a strategic move, a means of controlling her image in a world that scrutinizes her every gesture. But here is where the tension intensifies. William's discovery didn't remain within private walls. The mere existence of these emails triggered a chain reaction. Senior aides and advisors were summoned. Cybersecurity teams were brought in to trace metadata, timestamps, IP addresses. Every message, every encryption key, every signature was analyzed. It became immediately clear that these communications were deliberate, purposeful, and ongoing. There was no mistake, no casual chat that had slipped through the cracks. The implication was clear. Meghan had a role in shaping the narrative of Finding Freedom, despite the public denials. And that is what makes this revelation so explosive. Not merely that emails existed, but that they directly contradict everything publicly asserted. The discrepancy between private action and public statement creates a tension impossible to ignore. The narrative carefully constructed for years, the portrayal of Meghan as a reluctant figure, a victim of circumstance, a supportive partner to Harry, is suddenly under scrutiny. The story, it seems, had another author, her. This raises questions that the palace and the public alike are still grappling with. Was this a matter of strategic self-preservation or manipulation? Was Meghan protecting herself or orchestrating a broader narrative that served her own interests at the expense of family privacy and trust? And in the midst of all this, what does it mean for William, who discovered these communications not through gossip or rumor, but through careful examination of digital trails? The emotional stakes are enormous. Loyalty is tested, trust is shattered, and the decisions made in the coming hours and days could have implications that echo for generations. The psychological dimension cannot be understated. Imagine the conflict for William, brother-in-law, protector of family, upholder of centuries-old protocol, and suddenly discoverer of a secret that calls into question the integrity of his own household. The emails reveal not just factual information, but intent. The act of sharing personal information while publicly denying involvement speaks to a complex understanding of optics, media, and influence. This is not a naive mistake. It is deliberate. But while the palace scrambles to assess the scope and impact, the world remains unaware of the underlying orchestration. To the media, Meghan's public persona is intact, carefully polished. To the public, the narrative seems straightforward. A royal couple navigating scrutiny, media attention, and public expectation. Yet beneath this surface, encrypted messages reveal a different reality. And that is the tension, the irony, the contradiction that drives this investigation. Public silence versus private disclosure, media narrative versus hidden truth. The discovery also prompts questions about historical accountability. Has there ever been a breach of this magnitude in the modern monarchy? Are encrypted communications feeding personal insights to a ghostwriter unprecedented? William's realization is not just about information, it is about history, control, and reputation. By uncovering these emails, he has access not only to the past, but to the manipulation of narrative itself. The palace must now consider how to respond to a breach that is both digital and deeply personal. And it isn't just about the emails themselves. The chain of communication reveals a deliberate timeline, a calculated flow of information. Each email corresponds to key events, public appearances, interviews, strategic statements. It is as if Meghan anticipated questions, preemptively providing information in a controlled manner. The implication is chilling. The story presented to the public may have been guided, edited, and constructed in ways no one outside the inner circle could see. The stakes for the audience, for those watching closely, are equally compelling. These revelations aren't merely about palace protocol. They challenge the public's understanding of truth, authenticity, and trust. When someone as visible as Meghan is revealed to have been shaping narratives in secret, it raises larger questions. How much of the story have we been allowed to see? How much is constructed? And how do public denials reconcile with private orchestration? By the end of this introduction, the tension must be palpable. The audience understands that this is more than just a story about emails. It's about power, image, trust, and betrayal. The narrative stakes are clear. The monarchy is at a crossroads, and the decisions made in response to these emails could redefine relationships, protocols, and public perception. And yet, even as William grapples with the implications, as aides and advisors debate courses of action, as media speculation begins to swell, one fact remains undeniable. What he uncovered in those encrypted emails has the potential to change everything. Not just Meghan's public image, not just the narrative of finding freedom, but the very perception of who controls information, narrative, and truth within the royal family. It started as a routine scan. A check of the internal communications flagged for minor anomalies, a procedure so mundane that most people wouldn't even register it. But in the quiet halls of the palace, routine can quickly turn into revelation. Prince William had grown accustomed to anomalies, an unexpected press leak, a misrouted document, a staff email that hinted at undercurrents, but nothing like this had ever crossed his desk before. The first thing that caught his attention was a string of encrypted messages. At first glance, they appeared technical, almost innocuous. Scrambled lines of code, metadata buried in attachments, harmless enough for anyone without a forensic eye to dismiss. But William, methodical and precise, noticed a pattern. These weren't random. They followed a timeline, intersecting perfectly with major public events, interviews, and media releases related to Meghan and Harry. There was intention here, and there was precision. He called in his cybersecurity team. The room, usually silent except for the faint hum of monitors, became a war room of quiet tension. Analysts scrolled through the data, comparing timestamps, tracing IPs, and decoding layers of encryption that would have made most outsiders' heads spin. Every message had been deliberately secured, hidden behind protocols that suggested forethought, experience, and, most significantly, a clear understanding of how to avoid detection. And then came the revelation. The emails weren't just sent, they were crafted. Carefully. Deliberately. They weren't casual notes between friends. Each contained details about conversations, events, and moments that were supposed to remain private. Names, dates, personal opinions, even insights into private family discussions appeared within these digital threads, and all of it was connected to one person, a ghostwriter, someone linked to the creation of Finding Freedom. William's stomach tightened. The implications were immediate. The public story Meghan had told, the carefully managed narrative of restraint and independence, was at odds with what the emails revealed. There was a contradiction that could not be ignored. She had been feeding personal information to someone who would use it to shape public perception, while publicly maintaining a position of detachment. This was more than a breach, it was orchestration. The palace hierarchy was alerted, but with caution. Leaks and premature statements could worsen the situation. William's instinct was to understand fully before acting. The next hours were spent meticulously mapping the email chain, identifying every connection, every hidden address, every piece of information that had been shared. What emerged was a network of deliberate influence, a web that suggested foresight, planning, and intent. What made this discovery particularly striking was its subtlety. The emails didn't scream deceit. There was nothing overtly incriminating in the usual sense. No smoking gun labeled for palace eyes only. Instead, the subtlety of the communications was what made them powerful. Metadata suggested careful timing, messages aligned with key public appearances, as if each disclosure had been calculated to shape public perception while maintaining plausible deniability. The craftsmanship was undeniable. As William absorbed the full scope of what he had found, another layer of tension emerged. The ghostwriter wasn't a casual contact. This was a professional, someone with access to multiple sources and the ability to craft a narrative that would read as neutral, authoritative, and insider. And yet, here was evidence linking the narrative directly to Meghan herself. The implications weren't just about control, they were about narrative power. She had inserted herself into the story, shaping it from within, while the world believed she had no hand in it. The emotional stakes were immediate. William, who had always navigated the pressures of public life with caution and discretion, now faced a personal dilemma. How to address this breach of trust, this contradiction between private actions and public statements? Every option carried risk, confrontation, exposure, or strategic silence. Each could have consequences for family unity, public perception, and the monarchy's reputation. Palace advisors debated in hushed tones. Legal counsel, public relations experts, and senior aides analyzed every email, every word, every timestamp. They weighed the potential fallout, not just for Meghan, but for Harry, for the family, and for the institution itself. In these discussions, it became clear that the discovery was unprecedented. While breaches and leaks had occurred in the past, rarely had they revealed such a deliberate orchestration of narrative from within the family itself. Meanwhile, the emails themselves told a story. There were references to private conversations, insights into personal relationships, and anticipations of public reactions. Some emails hinted at planned disclosures, moments that would later appear in interviews or in media coverage. Others contained strategies, how to position certain events, which narratives to emphasize, and which to downplay. It was a roadmap of influence, and the trail led directly back to Meghan. For William, the realization was profound. Not only did this challenge the public narrative, it challenged his own understanding of the dynamics within the family. He had long viewed Meghan as a partner to Harry, someone navigating the pressures of royal life with intelligence and grace. But the email suggested another dimension, strategic, calculated, and entirely private. The juxtaposition between public persona and private action was stark, almost jarring. As the palace worked to assess the scope of the discovery, questions multiplied. How long had these communications been occurring? What other narratives had been influenced? Could the emails be used to anticipate further disclosures? And most pressing, what actions, if any, should be taken? The emails had not leaked yet, but the knowledge of their existence created a new tension. A silent pressure that demanded response. There was also a moral dimension. William had to consider the ethical implications of acting on private communications. While the emails suggested manipulation, They also contained deeply personal content, how to balance the need for institutional protection with the privacy of a family member. This was uncharted territory, and the weight of responsibility pressed heavily. The discovery sent shockwaves through the palace staff, though outwardly, everything remained calm. Advisors moved with discretion, ensuring that the chain of evidence was preserved. Analysts cross-referenced the emails with media reports, public statements, and internal records. Every detail mattered. A single misstep could escalate the situation, turn internal discovery into public scandal, and shift the narrative irreversibly. And yet, as the analysis deepened, a new realization emerged. This was bigger than just a breach. It wasn't simply about feeding information to a ghost writer. The emails revealed an ongoing effort to shape perception, to influence the narrative in subtle but profound ways. It was the work of someone deeply aware of both the mechanics of media and the vulnerabilities of the institution. The palace had always dealt with leaks, with external pressures, but internal orchestration at this level, calculated, encrypted, deliberate, was something else entirely. William faced a choice. He could confront Meghan privately, attempt to contain the situation, or escalate it through official channels. Each option carried consequences that extended beyond family dynamics. Reputation, public perception, and the delicate balance of monarchy were all at stake. And while he weighed these decisions, one truth remained undeniable. The discovery itself had already altered the landscape. Nothing would be the same. It was at this moment, late into the night, in the quiet of his private office, that William realized the full scope of what he had found. The emails were a roadmap, a strategic plan, a digital trail of influence. They weren't just communications, they were evidence of intent, an orchestrated effort to shape reality while maintaining plausible deniability. And for the first time, he truly understood the depth of the contradiction between public statements and private actions. The palace remained silent. Staff moved discreetly, the media unaware, the public oblivious. But behind closed doors, the weight of the discovery pressed heavily, and in that silence, a question hung in the air, unspoken but palpable. What would Meghan do when, or if, these emails came to light? How would the public reconcile her carefully maintained persona with the evidence now in William's possession? For the audience, for those who will eventually hear this story, the tension is clear. The discovery is not just about emails. It's about trust, narrative, and control. It's about the intersection of public perception and private action, and the consequences when the two collide. The emails are the first piece, the opening move in a game of influence that has far-reaching implications. And just when it seemed that the implications could not deepen further, William uncovered the most startling detail yet. One of the emails contained a direct reference to a planned public statement, aligned perfectly with a media interview. The timing, the content, the precision, it was almost surgical. It wasn't speculation or coincidence. It was deliberate orchestration. Someone had mapped out how private disclosures would intersect with public events to craft a narrative. And that someone was Meghan. Not all secrets are meant to be found. Some live in the quiet hum of servers, hidden in digital shadows, encrypted beyond the reach of casual curiosity. But others, no matter how well concealed, leave traces, breadcrumbs that, when followed carefully, tell a story far larger than the messages themselves. This was the world Prince William had stepped into the moment he examined those emails. And the story they told was far more complex than anyone could have anticipated. Encryption isn't casual. It's a language of secrecy, a shield against intrusion. For most people, it's an abstract term, a technical detail buried in the background of email settings or messaging apps. But for those who understand its purpose, encryption is both a protective measure and a deliberate signal. It says, in subtle code, what is contained here is sensitive, private, and not to be shared. And the emails William uncovered carried that signal clearly. The palace cybersecurity team approached the task methodically. First, they had to determine whether the encryption was standard protocol, merely a precaution, or whether it indicated deliberate concealment. The answer became apparent within hours. These emails weren't encrypted out of habit or procedural necessity. They had been crafted with deliberate care, using secure channels designed to prevent interception. Metadata suggested custom encryption keys, staggered timestamps, and communication patterns that pointed to intentional planning. Someone knew what they were doing. And that someone was Meghan. At first, it was almost unbelievable. Meghan, the public figure, the carefully curated persona who often spoke of transparency and openness, was communicating privately in ways designed to obscure her actions. Every detail in these encrypted emails, from headers to time zones to file formats, suggested forethought. She had established a pathway through which information could flow directly to a ghostwriter without leaving obvious traces. What made the discovery even more striking was the timing. The emails coincided with key public moments: interviews, charitable announcements, and media appearances. There was a rhythm to the communications, a pattern that implied strategic coordination. Metadata analysis revealed that messages were sent shortly before events that would later be reported in media outlets, often containing small details that would later appear as insider insight in Finding Freedom. The palace's digital experts traced the connections further, mapping not just the sender and recipient, but the network of intermediaries and potential digital shadows. Even slight deviations from the main communication pathway were noted: forwarded messages, encrypted attachments, and even subtle references that could be interpreted only by someone with prior knowledge. The implication was chilling. Every email was designed to be both secure and functional, carrying enough detail to shape a narrative while leaving no obvious fingerprints. William absorbed the gravity of the situation. These were not simple messages. They were instruments of influence. They allowed Meghan to participate in the creation of a narrative, subtly guiding the story without ever openly acknowledging her involvement. And the careful encryption was both a shield and a statement, a signal that the content was sensitive and that discovery would be consequential. The content of the emails themselves revealed layers of strategy. Some were mundane on the surface: observations about public events, commentary on interviews, or brief notes about Harry's schedule. But buried within were insights that suggested intentional framing: which topics should be emphasized, which statements could be positioned to create sympathetic narratives, and which moments should remain private to maximize impact when disclosed selectively. The palace team reconstructed the email chain meticulously. Each message was cross-referenced with public events, media reports, and internal memos. Patterns emerged that painted a portrait of calculated communication. It was narrative engineering. And the scale of it suggested that Meghan had a clear understanding of timing, optics, and influence, manipulating the flow of information with precision. One particular email drew immediate attention. It referenced a conversation Meghan had with Harry about a sensitive topic that would later appear in the media, framed as though it were disclosed voluntarily by Harry. The metadata suggested it had been sent days before the public interview. It was a small detail, easy for the average observer to miss. But for William and his team, it was proof of deliberate orchestration. This discovery raised profound questions. Was Meghan controlling the narrative to protect herself? To influence public perception, or to shape her legacy in a way that the family could not anticipate? The answers were not simple, and they carried emotional weight. William had to reconcile the evidence of planning and strategy with his understanding of Meghan as a person, a partner, a sister-in-law, someone who had been part of a family he valued and trusted. The technical complexity of the emails also underscored the emotional stakes. Encryption, in this context, was not neutral. It was a tool for both protection and concealment. It suggested an awareness of the consequences of discovery and an intentional effort to manage risk while maintaining control. Each message, carefully encrypted and precisely timed, carried the dual purpose of influence and invisibility. The palace advisors debated the meaning of these communications. Some argued that encryption alone did not prove wrongdoing, that it was possible for Meghan to communicate privately without malicious intent. Others pointed to the timing, content, and specificity of the emails, arguing that they were part of a deliberate strategy to shape public narrative while maintaining plausible deniability. The division underscored the complexity of the discovery. It was as much about intent as it was about content. Meanwhile, the emotional toll on William was mounting. The discovery forced him to confront a dual reality: the public narrative of Meghan as a supportive private figure, and the private reality of her deliberate communications. The contrast was stark, and it carried implications not only for family trust, but for the monarchy's reputation. How could he act without inflaming the situation? How could he protect the institution while confronting a family member whose actions had already disrupted centuries of protocol? William's approach was careful. He did not rush to confront Meghan. He focused on gathering evidence, documenting the emails, and understanding the full scope of the communications. Every step was taken with precision, balancing the need for transparency with the risk of escalation. In private, he reflected on the unprecedented nature of the situation. Encrypted communications feeding a narrative timed to coincide with public appearances, and hidden behind layers of digital security. This was not a minor breach. It was a calculated act of influence. And yet, despite the clarity of the evidence, uncertainty remained. Encryption provides a shield, but it also leaves gaps, interpretations that can be debated, intentions that can be questioned. William had to consider the possibility that the emails, while deliberate, could be misread or misunderstood. But as he reviewed the patterns, the content, and the context, it became increasingly difficult to argue otherwise. There was a coherent, intentional strategy at work, and it traced directly back to Meghan. The implications were not just private communications, they were instruments of influence, shaping public perception, framing narratives, and controlling the story in ways that the monarchy could neither anticipate nor easily counter. The discovery forced a reckoning. The balance of power, the control of narrative, and the trust within the family had all been challenged. Even the most seasoned palace advisors were struck by the audacity. Encryption, after all, is a deliberate choice. It signals both awareness and intent. To use it to guide a public narrative while maintaining plausible deniability is a level of strategic sophistication rarely encountered, particularly within the intimate confines of family communication. The emails were not just messages, they were evidence of orchestration, foresight, and subtle influence. As the investigation continued, William realized that the emails were only the beginning. They hinted at a broader strategy, a deliberate approach to narrative management that extended beyond simple correspondence. Each message, each encrypted attachment, each carefully timed note was a piece of a puzzle that, when assembled, revealed a meticulous plan for shaping public perception. And the fact that these communications had remained hidden for so long only heightened their significance. The palace remained in cautious silence. Staff moved discreetly, discussions were conducted behind closed doors, and the knowledge of the email's existence was limited to a select few. William understood that the discovery was not merely about the content. It was about control, about timing, and about the power to influence the story from within. And as he absorbed the full scope, a new tension emerged. What would happen when the emails could no longer remain private? The revelation posed more than just a family dilemma. It challenged the monarchy itself. Protocols, traditions, and expectations of discretion had been undermined. The ability to manage public perception had been compromised, and the existence of encrypted communications feeding a narrative created unprecedented risks. The situation demanded careful handling, but it also demanded decisions that could alter relationships, reputations, and the very understanding of trust within the family. And just when the implications seemed as deep as they could go, William uncovered a final, unexpected detail. One of the emails included instructions almost tactical in nature about which information could safely be shared and which should remain confidential. It wasn't simply sharing a story, it was managing influence, shaping perception, and controlling the timing of disclosure. The orchestration was complete, and the reach extended far beyond what anyone could have imagined. Who writes history? That question has haunted scholars, journalists, and storytellers for centuries. But within the modern monarchy, it carries a far more personal, immediate weight. Because in the case of Meghan Markle, the history that mattered, the story of her life, her marriage, and her influence on the royal family, wasn't just being recorded, it was being guided. And behind that guidance were figures the public rarely sees: ghostwriters and royal biographers, people whose pens wield power and whose words can define perception for generations. The palace had long understood the influence of writers. Memoirs, biographies, and journalistic exposés have always shaped public perception of the monarchy. They operate at the intersection of fact and narrative, blending meticulous research with compelling storytelling. But what made the discovery William had made so extraordinary wasn't just the existence of ghostwriters. It was the realization that Meghan herself had been feeding them material. And she had done so with deliberate care through encrypted emails designed to leave minimal traces. The ghostwriters in question were far from amateur. These were professionals, individuals with proven experience in capturing nuance, in shaping stories that read as both authentic and authoritative. They were the kind of writers who could take fragmented conversations, personal recollections, and strategic hints, and craft them into a narrative that felt seamless. And Meghan had, intentionally or not, positioned herself within that process, ensuring that her perspective, her private insights, would influence the story from the inside. William, sitting with the documents spread across his desk, could almost trace the threads connecting Meghan to these writers. The emails were precise, concise, yet layered. They referenced events, conversations, and observations that, on the surface, seemed harmless. But when matched with the content of Finding Freedom, the connections became undeniable. A detail mentioned casually in one email about a conversation in a garden, a remark made during a public tour, would later appear in the book as a carefully framed anecdote, lending authenticity to a narrative the public had assumed came from outside sources. The question that haunted William and his advisors was simple yet profoundly unsettling. Did Meghan fully understand the power she was exercising? Each email, encrypted and deliberate, suggested awareness. Awareness of timing. Awareness of impact. Awareness of how information, once processed by a professional writer, could shape the perception of millions. There was intention here. Strategy. A subtle, almost invisible hand guiding the narrative. The Palace team dug deeper into the ghostwriters themselves. Their backgrounds, previous works, and connections to media outlets painted a picture of influence and reach. These were not casual authors. They were skilled operators in the world of narrative and perception. By aligning herself with these writers, Meghan wasn't just telling her story. She was shaping it, strategically planting information to be harvested and transformed into public record. It became apparent that the encrypted emails served multiple purposes. They weren't merely a conduit for sharing private moments. They were instruments of control. By communicating selectively, Meghan could guide the narrative without ever appearing to interfere. The ghostwriters would interpret, contextualize, and expand on the fragments she provided, crafting passages that read as spontaneous insight rather than orchestrated disclosure. And yet, the subtlety of the process made the breach of trust even more significant. Publicly, Meghan maintained that she had little to no involvement in the creation of Finding Freedom. Her denials were clear, consistent, and persuasive, but the emails told a different story, a story of direct involvement, intentional guidance, and an understanding of how narrative could be shaped from the inside. The contrast between public claim and private action was stark, almost jarring. The emotional stakes for William and the palace were enormous. To have a family member strategically influencing public narrative while publicly maintaining distance threatened more than reputation. It challenged trust. Every advisor, every staff member, every aide involved in the discovery understood the implications. This was no longer a matter of media optics. It was a question of integrity, of loyalty, and of the boundaries that defined familiarity and institutional trust. Analyzing the emails, the team noted patterns that suggested calculated engagement. Certain messages were timed to coincide with key media appearances. Others referenced future statements, suggesting preemptive guidance. Some included detailed observations about Harry's interactions, moments meant to shape the perception of his decisions and character. The orchestration wasn't random. It was deliberate, sophisticated, and, in the eyes of the palace, profoundly destabilizing. The ghostwriters themselves, unaware of the scrutiny within the palace, had operated under the assumption that the material they received was provided voluntarily and authentically. But in reality, the emails revealed a controlled flow of information, a stream guided by someone with intimate knowledge of both the family and the mechanics of narrative construction. The distinction was subtle but significant, the difference between honest contribution and strategic influence. This led William to another unsettling realization. If Meghan had carefully guided one narrative, what other narratives might she have influenced? The potential reach extended beyond the book. Interviews, media appearances, charitable engagements, all could have been subtly shaped by private guidance, a thread of influence invisible to the public eye, but clear in the encrypted messages. The palace had to consider not only what had already been shared, but what might be in progress, shaping perceptions yet to be revealed. As advisors worked to map these communications, the emotional dimensions became more apparent. For William, the discovery wasn't just about protocol. It was about the personal betrayal of trust. Here was a family member, someone he had once considered an ally, carefully maneuvering in ways that undermined shared understanding and public transparency. The juxtaposition between private action and public denials was psychologically disorienting, leaving a lingering sense of uncertainty and unease. The analysis of the ghostwriter's correspondence also revealed the subtle artistry at work. Certain phrases were repeated, motifs reinforced, and narratives foreshadowed. What seemed casual or anecdotal in one email would later emerge in public discourse with polished resonance. This was storytelling at a level that requires both understanding and control. A quiet orchestration invisible to the casual observer, but deeply influential in shaping public perception. William's team also began examining the potential motivations behind Meghan's communications. Were they protective, defensive, or self-promotional? Was the strategy aimed at safeguarding personal privacy, guiding public understanding, or controlling the narrative to influence perception? The emails themselves suggested multiple layers, a complex interplay between self-interest, media awareness, and narrative shaping. There was no single simple answer, only the undeniable fact that deliberate action had occurred. The realization weighed heavily on the palace. Protocol, tradition, and loyalty had been challenged by an unseen digital hand. Encrypted emails, ghostwriters, and careful orchestration combined to create a breach unlike any other in recent memory. For William, understanding the scope was one thing. Processing the emotional implications was another, entirely. The knowledge that a family member had been guiding a narrative from within, while publicly denying involvement, created a tension that would shape decisions for weeks, months, and possibly years. And then came the most striking discovery. One of the emails contained a direct reference to an event that had not yet occurred publicly. It outlined key talking points, anticipated questions, and suggested responses, all aimed at shaping perception before the fact. This was forward-looking strategy, proactive influence, not retrospective disclosure. It demonstrated an understanding of narrative mechanics that was both sophisticated and, in the eyes of the palace, unsettling. The palace team realized that the emails were not just correspondence, they were instruments of influence, carefully calibrated to guide public understanding. Every detail mattered, every phrase was intentional, and every message was part of a larger cohesive plan. The orchestration was precise, strategic, and deliberate. And the implications for trust, for family dynamics, and for public perception were profound. As William considered the next steps, one thought persisted. If Meghan could operate with such subtlety, influence, and discretion, what else might be unfolding beyond the visible eye? The emails revealed only a portion of the narrative, but they hinted at broader patterns, strategies, and potential actions that had yet to be disclosed. The discovery was monumental, but it was only the beginning. And just as the palace began to comprehend the magnitude of this orchestration, a new threat emerged. One email suggested direct coordination not just with ghostwriters, but with individuals in the media, further amplifying the reach of these strategic disclosures. The subtlety and precision of the influence extended far beyond initial assumptions, raising questions about control, accountability, and the power of narrative itself. Every public statement Meghan Markle made now needed to be re-examined. Words that once seemed straightforward, sincere, even candid, suddenly carried an entirely different weight. Because behind those carefully constructed messages was a private reality, one that William had just uncovered. And the contrast was stark: public denial versus private orchestration. Meghan had always understood the power of public perception. From the moment she stepped onto the royal stage, she navigated scrutiny with precision. Every interview, every public appearance, every carefully phrased statement contributed to a narrative designed to cast her in a particular light. The supportive partner, the empathetic figure, the outsider turned insider with poise and grace. And yet, the encrypted emails William discovered suggested an entirely different level of agency. She wasn't just responding to events, she was shaping them, guiding the story, directing the narrative from behind the scenes. The palace team began cross-referencing her public statements with the emails. The results were striking. On more than one occasion, details shared in private correspondence had later appeared in interviews or media coverage. Casual observations, intimate conversations, personal reflections, everything that William had discovered in the encrypted threads now showed up in the narrative presented to the public as though it had originated elsewhere. For example, in one email, Meghan described a private moment, a candid conversation with Harry after a particularly challenging public event. The description was precise, noting body language, tone, even subtle expressions of concern. Weeks later, that same moment appeared in Finding Freedom, framed as if Harry had volunteered the insight independently, with Meghan positioned as a bystander or observer. The contrast between what was communicated privately and what was portrayed publicly was unmistakable. William's sense of betrayal deepened with each discovery. The emails weren't just about storytelling, they revealed a calculated approach to influence. Private disclosures were strategically aligned with public narratives, a choreography invisible to the audience but evident to anyone who examined the evidence. This wasn't casual sharing or innocent participation, this was deliberate shaping of perception. The tension between private action and public denial created a moral and ethical dilemma for William. How does one confront a family member whose words and actions have been so deliberately contradictory? How does one address not just a breach of trust, but an ongoing manipulation of narrative, all while preserving family dignity and public perception? These were questions without easy answers, and the palace advisors wrestled with them in hushed meetings. Media appearances added another layer of complexity. Meghan had repeatedly emphasized in interviews that she and Harry had not contributed to finding freedom, and that their private lives had been presented without their guidance. Publicly, she framed herself as a figure of integrity, someone who valued honesty and privacy. Privately, however, the emails told a different story: intentional, strategic, and precise disclosures of personal information. The contrast was almost cinematic, the irony sharpened by the fact that public perception had long relied on her statements as truth. William began to map these contradictions in detail. Each public denial was placed side by side with private email correspondence. Patterns emerged. Statements asserting distance or non-involvement coincided with encrypted communications providing exactly the information denied. The pattern was undeniable. Public messages were carefully crafted, deliberately inconsistent with private actions. In essence, there were two parallel narratives operating simultaneously, one for the world and one for those who could read between the lines. The implications of this duality were profound. For the palace, it wasn't simply a question of trust, it was a question of integrity and control. A member of the family was shaping narratives without transparency, undermining institutional credibility while maintaining a facade of detachment. The contrast between public denial and private action suggested not just a breach of protocol, but a sophisticated understanding of media influence and timing. William faced an additional challenge: how to address the public aspect of the narrative without escalating the situation or causing further reputational damage. Confronting Meghan directly could risk a family schism. Revealing the emails publicly could ignite a media storm beyond control. Yet ignoring the evidence risked compromising both trust within the family and the credibility of the institution. Every choice carried consequences, and none were simple. The palace also considered the psychological impact. What does it do to trust when a family member is revealed to have maintained one face for public consumption while privately directing events? How does one reconcile the persona presented to the world with the actions revealed in private correspondence? For William, the discovery was as much an emotional shock as it was an administrative or procedural problem. The emails challenged assumptions, reshaped understanding, and forced a reconsideration of both motive and character. Furthermore, the broader narrative was now at stake. The public had consumed Finding Freedom as an insider account, believing it to reflect the independent perspectives of Harry and Meghan. The encrypted emails suggested otherwise, that Meghan had influenced content in a deliberate way, guiding the story to reflect her desired image. This revelation called into question not just her public denials, but the authenticity of the book itself, and by extension, the narrative the world had come to accept as truth. The palace team also noted subtleties in the emails that revealed strategic thinking. Details were selectively disclosed, timing was carefully controlled, and information was presented in ways that minimized risk while maximizing influence. In one instance, Meghan provided an anecdote that appeared trivial, but when published, it reinforced a broader narrative about her personal values and relationship dynamics. Every communication was calibrated, and every calibration served a purpose. As advisors debated the implications, William's frustration and sense of betrayal grew. Here was a family member whose actions were not impulsive, not naive, not accidental, but deliberate. Public denials were not mere statements. They were part of a broader strategy designed to maintain control over perception. And while the emails themselves were secure, the knowledge of their existence created a pressure that demanded action, careful thought, and strategic planning. The contradiction between public denial and private action also raised questions about motivation. Why maintain such a dichotomy? Was it a desire for control, a strategy to manage personal image, or a broader plan to influence public understanding and historical record? The answers remained elusive, but the evidence was undeniable. The emails revealed not just participation in narrative construction, but an understanding of timing, optics, and influence. William recognized that this was a turning point. The discovery of encrypted communications had shifted the conversation from speculation to evidence-based analysis. It was no longer possible to argue that Meghan's influence on Finding Freedom was incidental or accidental. The contrast between what was publicly asserted and what was privately orchestrated was sharp, measurable, and deeply consequential. And yet, as William pondered the implications, another unsettling thought emerged. If Meghan had been orchestrating one narrative with such precision, what else might she have been influencing? Were there further undiscovered communications? Other moments of strategic guidance that had shaped public perception? The emails William had uncovered might only represent a fraction of the broader picture, and the potential scope was deeply unsettling. The palace team continued to analyze, document, and cross-reference. Each email was treated as evidence, each correspondence examined for context, intent, and timing. As they did, the picture became clearer. Meghan had not merely participated in shaping a narrative. She had directed it, subtly, skillfully, and deliberately. The public denials were part of a parallel story designed to protect personal reputation while influencing perception from within. And just as William was beginning to understand the full magnitude of this private orchestration, a new layer of revelation emerged. One email contained not just guidance for narrative, but instructions regarding public framing, media angles, and anticipated reactions. The sophistication was profound, the implications staggering. What had once seemed like an isolated act of influence now appeared as part of a coordinated strategy with significant reach and consequence. In the royal household, protocol is more than tradition. It is the architecture that holds centuries of monarchy together. Every gesture, every word, every access point is governed by unspoken rules, formal guidelines, and decades of precedent. And for Prince William, the discovery of Meghan's encrypted communications wasn't just a breach of trust, it was a violation of that architecture. The protocols designed to safeguard family privacy, public perception, and institutional integrity had been circumvented, subtly but deliberately. Palace protocol operates on two levels, the visible and the invisible. The visible is easy to understand. Public announcements, formal statements, approved speeches, and controlled media appearances. The invisible is far more complex. Private communications, family confidentiality, the internal flow of information, and the unspoken agreements about what is shared and what is kept contained. It's the latter that Meghan's actions had breached. William, a man steeped in the nuances of these rules, immediately recognized the gravity. These were not casual email exchanges. They were strategic, encrypted, and timed to coincide with major media events. They bypassed established channels, circumvented advisors, and directly influenced the narrative that the public consumed. In essence, Meghan had created a parallel system of communication that undermined the carefully managed protocols that governed both family and institution. The palace convened a series of urgent meetings. Senior aides, legal counsel, and protocol officers gathered to examine the situation. They debated, dissected, and cross-referenced each email, each attachment, and every trace of communication. The discussion was tense, measured, and at times quiet to the point of being deafening. No one wanted to escalate prematurely, yet everyone understood the implications. A breach of this magnitude could not go unanswered. One central question dominated: how to classify these actions. Were they minor infractions, missteps in judgment, or deliberate, strategic acts of influence? The evidence suggested the latter. Every email had been encrypted, every message carefully crafted, and every detail timed to coincide with public events or media releases. This wasn't an accident. It was a calculated circumvention of protocol. The advisors were especially concerned about the precedent this set. In a monarchy where tradition and hierarchy underpin authority, allowing one member to bypass established rules undermines the entire system. If Meghan could orchestrate communications with ghostwriters while publicly denying involvement, what message did that send to other members, staff, and the broader institution? It suggested that rules could be bent, boundaries could be redefined, and authority could be quietly circumvented. William faced a personal dilemma as well. Confronting a family member about a breach of protocol is never simple. But when that member is also a public figure with significant media influence, the stakes are magnified exponentially. The breach wasn't just internal. It had external implications. Media scrutiny, public perception, and political sensitivity all hung in the balance. Every decision had to account for both internal trust and external optics. The nature of the emails also raised questions about intent. Encryption, after all, is a tool. It can protect privacy, but it can also conceal deliberate action. The palace team considered whether Meghan's use of encryption was protective or strategic. Evidence suggested the latter. By hiding her communications from standard oversight channels, she created a layer of control over the flow of information, ensuring that narratives could be shaped while remaining insulated from scrutiny. The timing of these communications intensified the breach. Certain emails corresponded with media releases or key public engagements. In one case, an email provided details of a private conversation that would later appear as a key anecdote in Finding Freedom, framed as though it were spontaneously shared. In another, guidance about public messaging coincided with an interview, ensuring that narratives unfolded exactly as intended. The orchestration was precise, deliberate, and entirely outside the normal chain of command. The palace's legal advisors weighed in, highlighting potential implications. While there were no laws explicitly preventing encrypted communications with ghostwriters, the violation was of institutional norms and internal governance. Protocols exist not just as ceremonial tradition, they safeguard trust, hierarchy, and institutional integrity. Breaching them threatens the foundations of authority and accountability. Furthermore, the discovery forced a reevaluation of media engagement protocols. If one member could influence the narrative from behind the scenes, how could the palace ensure the accuracy, impartiality, and integrity of public communications? Every press statement, every interview, every public appearance was now potentially influenced by actions that circumvented internal oversight. It wasn't just a personal breach, it was a structural vulnerability. William also confronted the emotional dimension. Protocol isn't just about rules, it's about trust, predictability, and respect within a family and an institution. To have a member actively bypass those systems felt like a personal affront as much as a professional one. The breach wasn't merely administrative, it was relational. It raised profound questions about loyalty, intent, and the boundaries of personal agency within the palace framework. The palace team began mapping potential responses. One option was private confrontation, addressing Meghan directly, expressing concern about the breach, and seeking a commitment to adhere to protocol in the future. Another was internal disciplinary action, limiting access, imposing restrictions, or formally noting the breach in palace records. Each option carried consequences. Private confrontation risked defensiveness and conflict. Formal action risked public exposure and media scrutiny. The balance was delicate. Beyond the family, the breach also had implications for public perception. The monarchy relies on credibility, both internal and external. A breach of protocol that becomes public knowledge could suggest disarray, favoritism, or manipulation. It could undermine the very authority William was tasked to uphold. Advisors understood that the optics were critical. The response had to address the breach, reinforce protocol, and maintain institutional stability. As the palace deliberated, additional layers of concern emerged. The breach wasn't a one-time occurrence. It was part of an ongoing pattern involving multiple emails over months, strategically timed, encrypted, and directed at a professional writer. It wasn't impulsive, it was intentional. That intentionality heightened the stakes and underscored the need for a carefully calibrated response. The advisors also debated the broader implications for hierarchy. If Meghan's actions were left unchecked, what precedent would it set for others? Could other members bypass protocol, influence narratives, or selectively disclose information while publicly denying involvement? The palace recognized that the integrity of its rules depended on consistent enforcement. Exceptions could weaken authority, invite scrutiny, and erode trust both within the family and in the eyes of the public. William understood all of this. He wasn't simply confronting a breach, he was managing a systemic threat to order, perception, and trust. The encrypted emails were tangible evidence of action that undermined the very structures designed to protect the family and the institution. Protocol, tradition, and trust were all at risk. And yet, despite the weight of the discovery, the most concerning detail was still to come. One email, overlooked at first, suggested not just influence over a single narrative, but coordination across multiple channels. Public statements, media appearances, and internal communications were all potentially shaped by this encrypted network. The breach was no longer isolated, it was structural. It wasn't just a violation of rules, it was a blueprint for influencing perception while avoiding accountability. The palace team recognized the gravity immediately. Every advisor, every aide, every senior official understood that this was unprecedented. A family member had deliberately circumvented established protocols, influenced narratives, and maintained plausible deniability. It was a challenge to trust, hierarchy, and the very mechanisms that preserve the monarchy's stability. William, alone in his office late into the evening, reflected on the enormity of it. Protocol had always been a safeguard, not merely a formality, but a framework to manage complexity, maintain discretion, and ensure accountability. To have that framework undermined from within, with precision and forethought, was both unsettling and dangerous. It required careful handling, decisive thought, and a recognition that the implications extended far beyond the emails themselves. The palace now faced a decision: how to restore order, reaffirm protocol, and manage the emotional, relational, and public stakes. The breach had exposed vulnerabilities that could not be ignored. The rules, long considered sacrosanct, had been challenged in a way that demanded action. And just as William began considering potential paths forward, a new revelation emerged from the email chain, instructions that went beyond storytelling guidance. These messages included strategic recommendations for managing public reactions, framing narratives, and anticipating media scrutiny. The breach wasn't just about narrative influence, it was about controlling perception at every level. When news of Meghan's encrypted communications first reached the inner circle, reactions were immediate, but far from uniform. Allies, adversaries, and those caught somewhere in between began processing the implications in real time. Some were horrified, others were calculating, and a few, quietly, saw opportunity. The palace was no stranger to gossip, rumor, and intrigue, but this revelation cut deeper, because it wasn't speculation. It was evidence. The first reactions came from senior aides and close advisors. Many were stunned by the sophistication of the emails. Encryption, precise timing, strategic content. These were not errors, flukes, or casual correspondences. They indicated planning, foresight, and intent. A few whispered among themselves, "Has anyone ever done this before in the history of the modern monarchy?" The answer, as far as anyone could tell, was no. William, for his part, had to balance his personal shock with professional responsibility. Allies who had long supported Meghan cautiously approached, unsure how to reconcile loyalty with the facts. They reminded him of her charitable work, her public poise, and her careful attention to media appearances. Others were less restrained. Some advisors, feeling betrayed on a professional level, pushed for immediate action. Limit access, restrict communications, contain potential fallout. Their argument was simple. This wasn't just about family, it was about preserving institutional integrity. But not all reactions were aligned. Among the more politically savvy courtiers, speculation ran rampant. Who else might have known about these communications? Were there leaks? Could this knowledge be leveraged? The palace operates in layers, and every revelation ripples outward, touching not only the immediate family, but extended networks of influence, media contacts, and political observers. Some advisors worried that even internal awareness could lead to unintended exposure. The media, though still unaware of the encrypted communications themselves, began to sense tension. Journalists with palace contacts picked up on subtle cues: abrupt changes in appearances, unusual scheduling, whispered conversations. Leaks began to circulate, carefully filtered, suggesting internal discord without revealing specifics. This fueled speculation, and though the full story remained hidden, the pressure on the family intensified. Among Meghan's allies, reactions were more defensive. Some questioned whether the discovery was being interpreted fairly. Was it possible that encrypted communication was simply a precaution, a method to protect privacy rather than manipulate narrative? These voices argued that intent could not be conclusively proven and urged William to proceed cautiously. The tension between trust and evidence grew, highlighting the delicate balance he had to maintain between family, institution, and public perception. Adversaries, both internal and external, were quick to capitalize. Rivals within palace operations, long attuned to nuance and opportunity, saw the potential for leverage. The encrypted communications became a tool in whispered strategies, a way to question authority, loyalty, and judgment. Every word, every misstep became material for further debate, speculation, and influence. In a sense, Meghan's private orchestration had created ripples that extended far beyond her intentions. William's advisors also considered emotional fallout. Staff who had supported Meghan or facilitated communications were caught in a difficult position. Loyalty, discretion, and professional ethics collided with evidence of deliberate circumvention. Some staff expressed outrage at the breach. Others expressed concern about the fairness of attributing intent. The palace became a tension-laden environment, a microcosm of conflicting interests, loyalties, and interpretations. Public perception, too, began to loom as a factor, even before the emails were known. William understood that the monarchy operates not just on internal trust, but on credibility. Every public statement, every media interaction, and every appearance influences perception. The existence of secret communications had the potential to undermine credibility, not only in the eyes of the public, but among allied institutions, governments, and international observers. The stakes were enormous. There were also emotional dimensions. For William, betrayal was personal as much as institutional. Meghan had been not just a sister-in-law, but a member of the inner family circle. To discover deliberate orchestration of narrative while publicly denying involvement was a shock to both trust and relational equilibrium. Allies who had previously mediated or advocated for understanding now faced a different calculus. Could loyalty coexist with the emerging evidence? Meanwhile, adversaries quietly tested boundaries. Members of the extended royal network, media consultants, and former insiders began assessing how this discovery could shift influence. The emails weren't public yet, but their existence created an invisible power dynamic. Knowledge became leverage, and those who were aware of it, even partially, navigated a complex landscape of discretion, speculation, and strategic positioning. The palace also had to consider the potential for misinterpretation. Encrypted communications are, by design, opaque. Metadata can suggest intent, but human judgment interprets significance. Advisors debated endlessly. Was every email an act of orchestration, or were some simply protective or innocuous? The line between deliberate influence and incidental communication became the central question, and yet the pattern was difficult to ignore. It pointed toward strategy, planning, and deliberate control. The reaction of the media network connected to Meghan was another factor. Though unaware of the email's encrypted nature, they observed her public statements, appearances, and interviews with intense scrutiny. Analysts within the palace anticipated how the media might react if these communications ever surfaced. Even hypothetically, the potential for a public relations storm was staggering. Every ally and adversary understood that the existence of this discovery, once revealed, could reshape the narrative, the public perception, and even the broader royal image. William also considered the psychological dimension of this web of reactions. Allies were reassessing loyalties. Adversaries were calculating leverage. Staff were weighing ethics. And the family itself was navigating a tension between love, trust, and the need to uphold institutional integrity. Each reaction, each interpretation, each whispered assessment became a part of the story unfolding in real time. Even within the palace, some were struggling to process the duality, public innocence versus private orchestration. The human mind craves consistency, and this discovery defied expectations. A person who appeared transparent, engaged, and sincere could simultaneously orchestrate, manipulate, and control narrative. The dissonance created unease, even for those trained to manage scandal, secrecy, and strategy. As the team continued analyzing the emails, it became apparent that their influence extended beyond storytelling. Subtle instructions about public framing, anticipated questions, and suggested responses indicated that Meghan had considered not just content, but context. It was an understanding of media, perception, and timing that went far beyond casual communication. Allies, though initially hesitant to interpret intent, began to grasp the sophistication. Adversaries, predictably, saw opportunity. The palace environment became increasingly tense. Conversations were measured, meetings deliberate, and discussions sometimes fractured along lines of loyalty, interpretation, and perceived risk. William understood that each reaction, each position, and each assessment had the potential to shift internal dynamics, affect decision-making, and even influence how the breach would ultimately be addressed. And yet, for all the discussion, speculation, and debate, one fact remained unassailable. The discovery of encrypted communications had changed everything. Allies and adversaries alike were navigating a landscape that had been fundamentally altered. Trust, protocol, perception, and narrative were all in flux. Decisions were no longer straightforward, and the ripple effects would extend far beyond the initial discovery. Finally, just as the palace began to digest the implications of reactions across all levels, internal staff, advisors, allies, adversaries, and the media, a particularly concerning threat emerged. One of the emails suggested coordination with external media contacts, amplifying influence in subtle ways that the palace had not anticipated. The orchestration wasn't confined to ghostwriters.